Laughter rippled across the grand hall, the sound of champagne flutes clinking together in a symphony of well-rehearsed celebration. It was Silver Spoon's 20th anniversary, a night built on pride, power, and carefully curated smiles. But then, almost imperceptibly, the lights dimmed and the massive projection above the stage flickered to life, its glow bleeding into the polished faces in the audience. On the screen, a grainy video unfolded. A rigid, uncertain figure in a pristine uniform balanced a tray that trembled with each cautious step. A sharp, cutting voice sliced through the ambient hum of polite applause and conversation. "Do you even know what you're doing?" The man's shoulders stiffened, his body locking under the oppressive weight of that reprimand. The tray hit the table with a soft, dread-filled clatter. He lowered his head and, in a swift, furtive motion, pressed the back of his hand against his face. A silent attempt to mask tears, an effort so delicate it spoke volumes. In the grand hall, laughter faltered. Chairs scraped across the floor, eyes darted, narrowing with discomfort at the unfolding scene of humiliation. Those seconds stretched, thick and slow, until a single, resonant voice broke the silence. "This is me, Jackson." Your CEO gasps rose, sharp and sudden. From the shadows beside the stage, a man emerged, not in a tailored suit or polished shoes, but in the same plain shirt worn in the video. He tore away a fake beard, peeled off a wig. The deception fell away to reveal Jackson, unvarnished, vulnerable, real. "I left my office a month ago," he said, his eyes sweeping over the stunned faces. "I lived as one of my own employees, and this is what I found." His voice trembled slightly with the weight of that confession, an emotional fuse igniting in the silence. Somewhere in the crowd, a utensil clattered against a plate. The audience leaned forward. They sensed the raw truth about to be spoken, the kind of truth that refuses to be smoothed over. Later, in the boardroom, the air smelled faintly of cold coffee, like regrets left to go stale. Jackson sat at the head of the table, his gaze locked on a towering screen where a jagged line of crimson numbers plummeted downward. The graph bled into the corner like a wound no one wanted to name. Around him, executives shifted in their seats, paper rustled, pens clicked through proposals. "We can offset these losses by cutting ingredient costs by 15%, one manager suggested, tapping the table with clinical resolve. "Cheaper suppliers, fewer premium cuts. The customers won't notice." Another chimed in, sharper, "And reduce payroll, start with the longest-serving staff. Higher wages equal bigger savings." Jackson inhaled, tasting the metallic bitterness of that logic. "No," he said, first as a quiet murmur, then louder, urgent and steady. "No, we will not gut what made this company worth building. We will not betray the people who carried us here." The word "no" hung in the room, thick enough to bend the air. Across the table, Mark looked up, eyes flicking with a flicker of something cold, unreadable, sharpened by betrayal. Jackson felt the weight of that gaze, suspicion festering in the seams of trust. He thought, "The numbers are bad, but something else is worse. Something buried, breathing in the shadows of the company." He leaned back, anchoring himself in resolve. "I'll handle it," he murmured, more to himself than to the others. While the meeting resumed its drone over red charts and shrinking profits, Jackson already held a private decision. If the truth wouldn't walk into his office, he would go into the world to find it. The envelope on his desk was thin, edges softened by handling. Inside, a single trembling sheet of paper unfolded, its handwriting uneven, shaped by age. "Your soup. It's not like it used to be." The words paused on the page, as if the writer had hesitated mid-sentence, then pressed on. Jackson turned the sheet over, and there it was, a faded photograph. An elderly woman seated alone at a corner table, her coat draped over the back of the chair. In front of her stood a steaming bowl, steam curling upward like a memory made visible. Her small, certain smile spoke of familiarity and trust. of a comfort long taken for granted. He imagined the aroma of slow-cooked broth, the whisper of fresh herbs, warmth pooling like sunrise in a bowl. The letter continued, "I still come sometimes, but it's not the same. I miss my restaurant, but it's gone." Jackson stared until the letters blurred. The hum of the office outside faded away. He could see, in his mind's eye, the old dining room. Time-worn wooden tables lit by soft pendant lamps, the aroma of soup arriving before request, the warmth that preceded the meal. His grip tightened on the paper, the page crumpling softly. Grief curdled into resolve. If this woman felt such loss, how many others had too? And who had let the place she loved slip away? He slid the photo carefully back into the envelope. His eyes, once heavy with sorrow, now shone with unwavering purpose. On his screen, a silent email waited. The subject line was blank. No sender, just a string of meaningless letters. He hesitated, then clicked. The first sentence hit like a sledgehammer. "Mark has been skimming tips, threatening to fire anyone who doesn't hand over the money." Below, a photo. A printed receipt. Numbers clumsy and misaligned, altered, counterfeit. Ink darker in places, spacing off just enough to betray the lie. Jackson read it again, slower this time, lips pressed into a thin line of silent anger. A younger image of Mark, quick-haired, quick-wristed floor manager once entrusted with pride, flashed in his mind. Jackson had never questioned him. Now that trust felt like a bruise. The email's closing words were brief, almost casual. "Ask around, you'll find more." Jackson leaned back. The chair creaked under his weight. Disappointment knotted in his chest, sharpened with anger. Leadership meant protection. He had believed this deeply. If Mark had weaponized that belief, then Jackson had to find the proof. But without it, accusations were empty echoes. If Mark suspected scrutiny, the trail would vanish. His gaze drifted to the envelope from the old woman, and two disparate voices converged in one terrible realization. Something vital had broken. His plan began to form. He would walk through the doors not as CEO, but as someone unseen, close enough to hear the truth fall from the lips of a liar. Jackson closed his eyes, and beyond them time inverted. He remembered the scent of bread blooming from the oven, drifting down the narrow street until warmth wrapped around the block like a loving embrace. The little storefront once sparkled beneath the golden light of morning, its windows fogged softly by the warmth and life within. Back then, stepping inside was like stepping into a pulse, a heartbeat of laughter and movement. Staff weaved effortlessly between packed tables, their voices rising and falling in harmony with customers who called each other by name. Every seat was filled, yet no one seemed eager to leave. It wasn't just a restaurant. It was a second home, a living room for a neighborhood, a place where people belonged. Jackson remembered the sound of light footsteps tapping across the tiled floor. A girl, maybe 7 years old, darting toward him with the kind of joy that only childhood can carry. Her arms wrapped tightly around his waist. "This is my favorite soup in the whole world," she'd said, her wide eyes shining with sincerity. He had crouched down to meet her gaze, promising her with quiet conviction that it would always taste just the same. A vow spoken softly, but held with the full weight of honor. The memory pierced like a splinter, sharp, real, and dangerously tender. Yet when held up against the present, the contrast was devastating. The warmth had faded. The laughter now felt manufactured. The promises, once ironclad, now wore thin at the edges. Jackson inhaled deeply, as though breathing in the scents of that old kitchen could pull time back, as though memory itself could preserve what was slipping through his fingers. But it wasn't grief alone pressing into his chest. It was something deeper. Resolve. Steely. Unflinching. He wasn't just chasing flavors. He was chasing something far more elusive. The soul of a place that once made people feel seen, heard, safe. Whatever it took, he would bring it back. In the cold light of the preparation room, every surface gleamed too brightly. On the table before him were 3 wigs, each a shade away from truth, each a question of who he could become. Beside them lay 2 beards, neatly trimmed like costumes awaiting their role. A makeup specialist stood by, silent and observant, her eyes measuring him with the precision of an artist. He tried the first wig, short, neat, mousy brown. The man staring back from the mirror looked too close to the real Jackson, too familiar. He shook his head. Then came the second. Longer, streaked with gray, deliberately unkempt. Paired with a beard, it gave the illusion of weariness, of a man accustomed to being ignored. He adjusted a pair of wire-rimmed glasses, watched how the light bent differently around his eyes, changed posture, lowered his shoulders, let his weight sag slightly to one side. He practiced speaking, not as a leader, but as someone who didn't expect to be listened to. A slower cadence, a quieter tone, a smile, not calculated for charm or deals, but one that looked like it belonged to someone who'd stopped expecting too much from life. Even the act of averting his eyes subtly reshaped who he was. By the time he added the final details, the last layer of hair, the final tone of skin makeup, he was someone else entirely. The reflection in the mirror no longer bore the posture, the presence, or the authority of a CEO. He saw someone forgettable, someone passed over. And that was the point. On the table lay a crisp new uniform, stiff with fresh folds. Beside it, a wristwatch that looked ordinary but held a discreet microphone under the polished metal. The third button of his shirt gleamed faintly, hiding a tiny camera that would record more than anyone realized. Jackson ran his finger over it lightly, memorizing its place as though it were a lifeline. He slipped on the uniform, the unfamiliar fabric reshaping his posture. It smelled of starch and storage, not yet worn by sweat or story. Picking up an empty tray, he practiced moving with it, first slowly, then with increasing confidence. A glass of water followed. He walked with careful steps, learning the rhythm, the invisible dance of balance and grace. From across the room, his advisor called out in a low voice, steady and firm. "Be patient. Listen more than you speak." Jackson didn't respond right away. Instead, he lowered the tray against his hip and stared at a distant point, his mind already drifting into the space where he'd soon live as someone else. Then, with a single nod, he accepted what he had to become. Every breath, every gesture, every word. They would all be deliberate. He couldn't afford even a flicker of the man he used to be. From tomorrow on, he would not walk into his office. He would walk through a different door, a door where no one knew his name. That night, the building settled into silence, its soft hum like a heartbeat easing into sleep. Jackson sat alone, surrounded by shadows and memory. On his desk lay the old woman's letter, its creases deepened by how often he had opened and reread it. Beside it, his laptop cast a cold light, the anonymous email still glowing on the screen. The receipt, the accusation, was there too, crisp and damning. A photograph lay near the edge, a younger version of himself smiling beside. Mark, both men full of belief in what they were building. Jackson picked it up, studied it, and then slid it gently into an envelope, along with the letter and the email. He pressed the flap closed with a solemn touch. The seal was soft, but final. He closed the laptop. Darkness returned. Only the glow of the silver spoon sign remained, shining faintly through the window, casting long shadows over his desk. The light reached across the room, brushing the envelope like a memory trying not to be forgotten. Jackson stood, his eyes scanning the space he had built. This was the room where victories were toasted, decisions were made, and sometimes, too often, warnings were ignored. Tonight, it felt less like a sanctuary, and more like a place he would need to earn his way back into. He turned. The sign's light caught his shoulder, wrapping him one last time in the brand he had given his life to. Then, without another glance, he stepped out into the dark. The next morning the air was cool, crisp with anticipation and unease. Jackson entered the central branch wearing a name that wasn't his, in clothes that had never fit him until now. The uniform still held the stiff smell of newness. It pinched at his shoulders with unfamiliar authority. Shannon was waiting, leaning near the counter, arms crossed. Her eyes raked over him slowly, clinical, unimpressed. "Let's hope I don't regret putting you on the floor," she said, her voice tight and cold as concrete. Jackson offered only a nod. No retort, no smile. Just the stillness of a man who understood the value of silence. He observed quietly. Staff buzzed around him with a rehearsed rhythm, but no one really saw him. A young waiter gave a brief hello without meeting his gaze. Others didn't bother. It was the kind of courtesy reserved for ghosts. Mechanical, empty, gone before it mattered. The air was dense, not just with the aromas of grilled meats and simmering sauces, but with tension. It clung to the walls. Orders were shouted without energy, plates clattered with more weight than noise. Even the floor seemed to swallow sound. Shannon handed him a worn order pad. "Table 6, she said, turning away before his hand had closed around it. He tightened his grip on the notepad and shifted the tray against his arm. With each step toward the dining room, the air thickened, familiar scents blending with the unfamiliar chill of watching eyes. This was the first layer of the truth, and already it pressed close. At table 5, a man in a stiff shirt laid down his fork, pushing his plate forward. "The meat's tough. I can't eat this," he said with controlled firmness, his tone practiced, polite. Jackson gave a small nod, an apology buried in silence. He picked up the plate, the fading steam trailing like a ghost, and turned, moving toward the kitchen, where deeper truths waited to be uncovered. Just as Jackson was about to push through the swinging door to the kitchen, Shannon's voice sliced through the air like a blade. "Don't let the regulars see you walking back with a plate," she said, her words coated in thinly veiled disdain. "It looks bad." Her gaze was hard and sharp, and her tone made it clear this wasn't advice. It was an order. Jackson paused mid-step. With a faint, practiced smile, he turned back to the guest and said gently, "They're preparing a fresh one for you now." The man seemed satisfied, leaning back in his chair with casual approval. But behind Jackson's neutral mask, the weight of performance was already sinking in. Inside the kitchen, the air thickened immediately, dense with heat, and laced with the bitter tang of grease and metal. The noise was constant. Clattering utensils, sizzling pans, voices raised just slightly above necessity. A cook, sweat clinging to his brow, glanced at Jackson's plate and leaned in with an offhand suggestion. "Just swap it with Table 9's order, they won't know the difference." Jackson's fingers tightened imperceptibly around the edges of the plate. Time seemed to still around him, the chatter and clanging dulling to the sound of his own heartbeat. He gave no reply. No expression. He simply set the plate down where he was told, his face unreadable. But inside, another line had just been added to a growing mental ledger, a quiet betrayal. As the lunch rush surged forward, Jackson's movements became more deliberate. Every shortcut taken, every corner cut was another thread he followed. A pattern was beginning to emerge. And it wasn't just carelessness. It was a culture, layered in silence and compromise. Near the end of the shift, Jackson approached the VIP table with steady hands, balancing a tray like second nature. But just before he reached them, a glass slipped, and a thin stream of water splashed across the white linen. It spread quickly, darkening the fabric like ink seeping into a blank page. Shannon appeared instantly, her voice low but lethal. "This is a restaurant, not a street stall. Do you understand the difference?" She didn't raise her voice, but her words carried venom with precision. From the next table, a soft laugh escaped. Someone else whispered behind a cupped hand. Jackson bowed his head, offering a quiet apology. He blotted the water with a cloth, his movements calm, contained. But beneath the surface, his chest tightened with heat. Not embarrassment, not shame, but anger. It wasn't about being corrected. He could take that. What stung was the public performance of authority, using him as a prop to assert dominance. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw a young waiter near the wall, his head lowered, shoulders hunched slightly. Their eyes met for a fleeting second, just long enough for recognition to flicker, then vanish. Fear, Jackson thought, not of failure, of being seen caring. He finished cleaning the table and moved on, but the echo of that moment lingered. It wasn't just the food. It wasn't even the money. It was the erosion of dignity, bit by bit, shift by shift. And as the day wore on, Jackson could feel the weight of it pressing closer, like a storm cloud building. When the dining room finally emptied, it smelled faintly of detergent and overused cloths. Jackson carried a stack of plates toward the counter, where Shannon was quietly counting the day's earnings. Her hands moved with well-practiced ease, sweeping coins and bills from the tip jar into a neat pile. Then, as casually as someone brushing off crumbs, she slid the money into a plain envelope and tucked it into her personal bag. A nearby waitress froze mid-step, her lips pressed into a line, jaw tightening. But she said nothing, just lowered her gaze and moved on. Jackson noticed everything. Shannon, meanwhile, opened a large ledger with an air of practiced disinterest. Her pen scratched across the page, columns of numbers, dates, entries that looked official enough from a distance. Jackson stayed at the edge of the room, wiping a corner of the table with meticulous focus. But his eyes kept drifting back, catching glimpses of cash and ledger entries that didn't line up. Then came a detail that couldn't be explained away. A crisp bill, edges still sharp from the register, vanished into the envelope that was now nowhere in sight. It happened quickly. Routine, invisible to most, but not to him. For the first time since entering the restaurant Undercover, Jackson didn't feel confusion or suspicion. He felt certainty. This wasn't just misconduct. It was a system, a rigged game with rules written in silence. And it had a face. He stood, set his tray down as if the shift had simply ended, and turned away. But inside, a new line had been drawn. The game had changed. At the suburban branch, the contrast was stark. The exterior looked tired, its paint faded by sun and rain, its sign barely readable. Inside, the kitchen reeked of old oil, the air hanging thick and heavy. He was handed an apron without a word and pointed toward a mountain of dirty dishes. The dish station was overwhelming, plates and glasses stacked high and unsteady. Steam coiled into the air like exhausted ghosts. And still, under it all, the sour tang of rotting food clung stubbornly. A man beside him, older and worn by time, spoke with the resignation of someone long past caring. "Don't waste your time scrubbing. Just rinse and send 'em out. No one'll notice." His voice wasn't cruel. It was tired. Jackson gave a slow nod, as if accepting the advice, and dipped the plate into the water. But his stomach turned. Every shortcut like this had a cost, and he knew who paid it. The people who trusted their meals were clean, the families who brought their children here, the elderly who remembered better days. In the corner, he spotted a plastic bin, half hidden behind a shelf. Inside were bundles of leftovers, repackaged and labeled with tomorrow's date. He saw a bread roll, faint, teeth marks still visible. His throat tightened. He rinsed another plate, but the memory of that bin burned into his mind. This wasn't a one-time mistake. It was policy written in rot. The break room was little more than a closet, a window smeared with grease muting the outside light. Jackson sat at the end of the table, lukewarm food untouched on his tray. Around him, the staff ate quickly, shoulders hunched like shields. If you scrub too much, they dock your hours, one man muttered, jabbing at his meal with a plastic fork. Laughter followed, dry, bitter, and resigned. Not humor, but habit. Jackson didn't look up. He chewed slowly, listened deeply, absorbed everything, every word, every silence. Because the story he came to uncover wasn't about one man, or even one crime. It was about how a company he built had let rot settle into the corners, quiet, slow, and devastating. And the only way to clean it was to bring it into the light. Across from him in the break room, a woman leaned in just enough for her voice to slip beneath the room's drone. "That chicken? It was sent back yesterday," she murmured, her fork scraping faintly against the edge of her plate, soft but sharp. "Different plate, same food." The words struck hard, a quiet indictment that vibrated against Jackson's ribs. He felt anger twist within him, tight and rising, an emotion born not from surprise, but confirmation. This was real. This was happening. But his face stayed still, only a slight mechanical nod betraying the storm beneath. He glanced around the room at the others, calloused hands, slouched shoulders, eyes that rarely looked up anymore. People who whispered the truth in fragments, then buried it in silence. They were survivors of an ecosystem built on resignation. In that moment, the magnitude of the rot settled on Jackson's shoulders. This wasn't just about stolen tips or spoiled meat. It was the decay of integrity, slow, invisible, grinding down expectations until wrong felt normal. Until dignity was something they traded in for a paycheck. He placed his fork on his plate. The sound was small, barely audible under the hum of conversation, but in his mind, it marked something final. A line crossed, a vow made. This would not be their normal for much longer. At the commercial district branch, appearances whispered perfection, gleaming counters, polished tile floors, and a manufactured citrus scent lingering in the air. But beneath that shine, Jackson caught the chill. Behind the podium, a young hostess smiled, a little too tightly, and glanced quickly toward the manager before returning her gaze to the reservations list. Jackson stepped in closer, just enough to overhear. "If they didn't tip in advance," the manager murmured, voice low and indifferent, "make them wait 10 minutes. Maybe more." It wasn't said with cruelty. It was said with efficiency, cold, corporate detachment dressed as policy. Outside, rain streaked down the wide front windows, turning shapes into smudges, but not erasing their meaning. A family stood just beyond the glass. The father straightened his back as if posture alone could protect their dignity. The mother's coat clung to her shoulders, dark with damp. A young boy nestled against her side, his fingers curled tightly around her hand, his hair stuck to his forehead, his eyes fixed on the light spilling from inside. Beside him, his sister stood motionless, cheeks pink with cold, her gaze locked on the tables within. The promise of warmth, food, and welcome just out of reach. Jackson felt something deep shift inside him. Years ago, he had seen that same look on the faces of those who believed in what Silver Spoon once was. Back then, hope came with a menu. Now it stood out in the rain. The manager had already moved on. The hostess called the next name, her voice skipping the family entirely. Jackson didn't flinch. But inside, his fury cooled into something harder. This wasn't indifference. It was design. Executed casually, defended by silence, and done under his name. He slipped out through the side door. The rain hit him immediately, cold against his skin. A block away, the scent of fresh bread led him to a small bakery. He stepped inside, the warmth like a balm, and purchased a single loaf, still hot enough to steam through the paper bag. Back at the restaurant, the family remained beneath the narrow awning. The rain had softened into mist, but their coats were soaked through, and the boy's fingers looked pale and stiff. Jackson approached and held out the loaf with a quiet smile. "Just something warm while you wait," he said. The father hesitated, just for a second, his eyes flicking between Jackson's face and the gift. Then he nodded, voice rough with gratitude. "Thank you." The boy broke off a piece. The crust crackled. His smile, small but genuine, cracked through the gray. Jackson turned back toward the building, that warmth lingering in his chest, but tempered with something bitter. This wasn't how kindness should have to happen. Not as a patch over institutional cruelty. Not in secret. As he stepped inside, he caught the hostess watching him. For the briefest moment, her eyes softened. Something unspoken passed between them. Recognition. Maybe even approval. He didn't speak. Didn't need to. A seed had been planted. Not just outside in the rain, but here, in the silence behind a desk. The flagship branch buzzed with controlled chaos. Pans clanged, orders shouted, the walls echoing with the pulse of dinner service. But beneath the movement, something felt off. The air was sour, just faintly, with the smell of meat that had turned. Tony, the head chef, stood at the prep table, arms crossed. He glanced at Jackson without interest. "Rinse the greens. Keep up," he muttered before turning away. Jackson rolled up his sleeves, taking a bin of herbs and lettuce to the sink. Beside him, Lan, a new hire with delicate hands and tired eyes, spoke softly, showing him how to trim the stems just right. There was care in her voice, the kind that only came from someone who still believed these little things mattered. Across the table, Tony worked quickly, too quickly. He pulled 2 trays into view, one fresh, the other lined with meat that was pale, the edges beginning to curl. Without hesitation, he began mixing them. The old hidden beneath the new, a lie layered beneath a truth. Lan froze mid-chop. Her eyes met Jackson's for a heartbeat, then she shook her head subtly. Tony caught the movement. His head snapped around. The warning in his stare was unmistakable. Lan lowered her gaze and went back to work, her hands suddenly mechanical. Jackson rinsed another leaf. Cold water over cold fingers, but his mind was fixed on that prep table. This wasn't ignorance. It was intimidation. This kitchen didn't run on rules. It ran on fear, and fear moved faster than food. Later, as the kitchen sweltered with heat, Tony slid a metal tray toward Lan. Steam coiled up in thick ribbons. "Table 6, he barked, not even looking up. The tray was heavy, too much for one person. Lan braced it against her chest, arms trembling under the weight. Her glasses fogged, her steps careful on the slick floor. Then she stumbled. Just slightly. Jackson moved without thinking, catching the tray's edge before it tilted. Tony's voice cracked through the air. Let her handle it. Not loud, but sharp. Lan tightened her jaw and pressed forward, the sweat darkening her back. When she returned, Jackson leaned in. "Why don't you tell someone?" he whispered. She didn't stop cutting. Her voice was low, almost lost in the noise. "Here, if you speak up, you're out." It wasn't defiance. It wasn't fear. It was truth. The kind that didn't live on paper, but in glances, in silences, in survival. Jackson turned back to the sink. His hands worked on instinct, but his mind churned. By the time dinner service hit its peak, the kitchen was alive with tension. Jackson ladled soup into a white bowl, steam curling up, rich with herbs and slow-cooked care. Beside him, Lan adjusted the final seasoning, her movements delicate but sure. This was the recipe he remembered. Fresh cream, real stock. Nutmeg, just enough to warm. No shortcuts. Moments after it left the kitchen, a voice floated back from the floor. "This," someone said, clear and amazed, "is exactly how it used to taste." There was a pause, then, "It reminds me of being a kid." Lan glanced at Jackson, just a flicker, and smiled, small but proud, then turned back to her work. Tony stepped in, his face hard. "Who made that soup?" His voice was controlled, but the pressure behind it was unmistakable. Silence followed. heavy, daring someone to speak. Lon lowered her gaze. Her knife moved quickly. Jackson kept stirring, expression unreadable. Tony lingered a second too long, then turned and walked away, each footstep like a drumbeat. Jackson etched the moment into memory. A turning point. Truth had flavor, and it couldn't be ignored forever. The praise from the dining room still echoed in Jackson's ears. The quiet pride in Lon's smile, the way her shoulders lifted just slightly as if remembering why she started. Those small moments mattered. It wasn't much, but it was a crack in the wall, and Jackson knew better than anyone. All change begins with a fracture. The warehouse, by contrast, was where hope went to die. The air hung heavy with the stale scent of damp paper and cold rot, a smell that didn't wash off. One dim bulb swung overhead, casting a weak yellow glow over a floor streaked with years of neglect. Near the back, a stock manager slouched in a folding chair, thumb flicking lazily across his phone. He didn't look up when Jackson entered. Along one wall, towers of rice sacks teetered. The ones on top looked fine. Clean burlap, tight seams, but halfway down, Jackson spotted the truth. One had split open. The grains were stuck together in clumps, speckled with mold. The smell was faint, but sharp, inescapable. Right next to them sat unopened bags, fresh, untouched. In the freezer nearby, slabs of meat lay beneath layers of plastic wrap turned cloudy, the edges tinged a dull, sickly gray. "Why hasn't this been thrown out?" Jackson asked, his voice low but tight. The manager barely glanced up. "Still cooks fine." Then looked back at his phone, indifferent. Jackson turned his attention to the clipboard by the door. He flipped through the latest invoices, and his stomach turned. The numbers for beef, for rice. They were grossly inflated. He knew the actual prices by heart. These weren't mistakes. They were lies padded with greed. He let the clipboard hang by its hook again, the plastic cool in his fingers, but the weight of what he'd uncovered was anything but. This wasn't sloppiness. It was theft, systematic and shameless, and it was being paid for by the people who trusted the name above the door. As he walked out, each step felt like dragging chains, but something stopped him at the threshold. He looked back once more. The signature on the invoice, the sharp curve on the final letter, the flourish at the end. He'd seen it before. Countless times, memos, reports, contracts, Mark. The name settled into his chest like a stone dropped into still water. And then everything began to stitch together. The fake invoices, the spoiled ingredients, the stolen tips, the altered receipts. All the quiet corruption hadn't been isolated acts. It had been a design. And Mark had been at the center of it all. Jackson saw him again, seated at the boardroom table, that carefully neutral face, that barely there smirk when someone mentioned cutting costs. The way his eyes tightened when Jackson refused to compromise. This wasn't about survival. This was about power, about control, masked as practicality. Jackson's pulse slowed, not from calm, but from razor-sharp focus. The long game was over. Every minute Mark remained in control. More trust bled out of the company like slow poison. He reached for his phone, then stopped. Not yet, not without something irrefutable, something that would silence denial before it could even form. But the clock had started ticking, and this time, Jackson would be the one counting down. Back at the central branch, the tension in the air was unchanged, like a song stuck on one dissonant note. In the corner, Tommy moved between tables, collecting plates with the careful rhythm of someone who had long since stopped hoping things would get better. As Jackson passed, Tommy leaned close enough for his words to reach. "You're the only one who listens," he said quietly. Jackson paused. The words felt heavy. "Last week, Shannon took half my tips, just took them, said it's how it works here." He gripped the edge of the tray tighter. "I thought about quitting, but my sister's still in school. I can't leave yet." Jackson's jaw tightened, but his voice stayed steady. "Are there others like you?" Tommy gave a slow nod. His eyes flicked up, tired, but not empty. In them, Jackson saw it, an ember of hope. These weren't isolated incidents. They were patterns etched deep into the walls of his own house. As Tommy walked away, Jackson remained still, hands loose at his sides, breath quiet. But inside, the decision had been made. No more waiting, no more watching. At a quiet cafe later that evening, the lighting was soft, gentle in a way that made the hard truths easier to speak. Lon slipped in, still in her work clothes, hair pulled back, face tired but alert. She sat across from Jackson, hands wrapped around a warm mug she barely touched. "I joined because I love the craft," she began, her voice threading the space between them. "I thought I'd learn from the best." The words caught in her throat. She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. Jackson leaned in slightly, not to press, but to offer space. "Tony uses the cheapest ingredients he can get," she said, her voice turning steel-edged. "If anyone says no, they're gone. No warning, no questions, just gone." Her grip on the mug tightened. "I'm scared of losing my job, but I'm more scared of losing my faith in what I do." Jackson felt that. All of it. The heartbreak, the pride, the refusal to let go of something sacred. "You're not alone in this," he said quietly. For the first time, she looked up, and in her eyes, he saw it. Trust. In that moment, Jackson knew this wasn't just about exposing what was wrong. It was about reclaiming what had once been right. The next few days were spent in silence, but not of inaction. Jackson became a shadow in his own empire. Cameras hidden in shirt buttons, mics woven into watch bands. Every word, every motion, every theft recorded. Shannon, sliding thick envelopes into her purse, eyes darting like a thief who doesn't believe she's being watched. Tony, blending old meat into new batches like mixing paint, unbothered by the ethics. The warehouse, again and again. Moldy rice, tainted meat, doctored invoices, and finally, Mark's signature, stamped onto inflated orders, hidden inside ledgers dressed in corporate polish. Then came the voices. Lon, steady and clear, describing the loss of standards with precision and pain. Tommy, quieter, recounting his tips being stripped away. Piece by piece, the case built itself. And at night, Jackson laid it all out on his desk. Photographs, receipts, audio files, video stills, transcripts, timestamps, proof, not whispers, not rumors, reality. For a long time, he stared at the file. It was more than paper. It was the cost of forgetting his own foundation. Now, the question wasn't if he'd act. It was how and when. The answer had already been chosen. The 20th anniversary of Silver Spoon, what everyone expected to be a celebration, would instead be something else entirely. It would be Judgment Day. Jackson drafted the invitations himself. His pen moved with steady purpose, each stroke of ink a quiet declaration. The calligraphy wasn't just elegant. It was deliberate, weighted, as if every loop and curve carried the tension of everything that had led to this point. Every board member, every regional and branch manager received one. But more importantly, so did the people who mattered most, the ones whose names had once been whispered with affection across dinner tables. Loyal customers, veterans of the early days. People who remembered when Silver Spoon still meant something sacred. Among them, Lon and Tommy. But tonight, they would not wear aprons or carry trays. They would walk into the hall as honored guests. Jackson wrote their names in a different pen, a finer script, a private flourish. It was his way of saying, "You mattered. You still do." Behind the scenes, a quiet team assembled under strict instruction. Technicians who asked no questions tested the screen 5 times, wires threaded like veins beneath the stage, every signal carrying one truth: no one hides anymore. The seating plan was orchestrated to precision, sympathy seated beside suspicion, Allies positioned to witness every betrayal firsthand. Lighting was programmed so that no shadow could linger. Every cue, every breath of the program was designed for inevitability. Only one person knew enough to sense the weight of what was coming: his advisor. "When this starts," Jackson had said, his voice low and even, "everything changes." And the answer had come like a stone falling into still water. "Once it does, there's no going back." Jackson had only nodded. That was the point. The night arrived draped in gold, the air heavy with praise before the fall. The banquet hall shimmered under crystal chandeliers, laughter bouncing off marble and glass. Waiters flowed through the room like dancers, trays balanced with silent grace. Mark was already there, his handshake too firm, smile stretched too wide, his confidence bordering on smugness. Shannon flitted from guest to guest, her laugh tight and rehearsed. Tony loitered near the buffet, speaking to a cluster of chefs in clipped private tones. Jackson walked among them like a ghost in his own house. The tailored suit clung cleanly to him, his hair combed differently, his posture subdued. He was invisible by design. No one looked twice. He stayed at the edges, letting the tide of the room move around him. And from that quiet vantage point, he saw everything. He saw how power postured. He watched alliances flicker in glances, how laughter rose a second too late, how fear shimmered beneath every "congratulations." He moved slowly, measuring his breath, the weight of the moment pressing against his chest like armor. The giant screen stood ready behind the stage, still silent, still blank. But soon, it would speak louder than any voice. Mark ascended the stage with the smooth grace of a man who believed the story belonged to him. He opened with praise, of growth, of dominance, of legacy. His words flowed like oil, measured, smooth, dangerous. Tony nodded along like the speech belonged to him too. Shannon clapped on cue. The audience followed, though the applause was more politeness than passion. Jackson's gaze swept over them, memorizing the faces, the ease, the arrogance. Mark's arms spread wide as he promised an unstoppable future. Then, flicker. The lights dimmed. A shadow swept across the room like a curtain falling. The screen behind Mark ignited. No titles, no narration, just an image. Grainy but clear enough to cut. Shannon, in the back office, sliding a thick envelope into her purse, her fingers quick, her glance toward the door calculated. The sound of rustling money, though silent, echoed inside everyone's head. Gasps. Mark froze mid-sentence, his voice stuttering to a halt. Tony stiffened. Every guest turned toward the screen, their forks forgotten. Then, the kitchen. Tony's hands mixing spoiled meat into fresh. The swirl of decay hidden beneath spice and heat. A gasp, sharper this time, from a woman near the front. "Oh my God," someone whispered, too loudly. Next, the storeroom. Mold-blackened rice stacked beside pristine bags, cheese blooming with rot. The footage didn't need words, the images hit the senses. Murmurs turned into outrage, then documents, a close-up of padded invoices, numbers swollen with theft, and the signature, large, confident, unmistakable. Mark. His face paled, the stage no longer his. Finally, the screen faded to black. Silence, then voices, calm, clear. Lan's voice, steady. Tommy's, soft but strong. Their testimonies carved through the air, about stolen wages, threats behind closed doors, tips vanished into greedy hands. Each sentence struck like a scalpel, not shouted but surgical. The room turned, eyes searching for the faces behind the sins. And Jackson stood in the corner, still hidden in shadow, letting the silence expand, letting it sting. Then the screen held one final image, Mark's signature, and faded. A moment passed. Then Jackson stepped forward. No lights cued him, no fanfare followed, just the soft hush of realization. He moved slowly into the glow, "I am Jackson," he said. "Your CEO." Head snapped toward the voice. He pulled away the beard, the wig. He shed the disguise with one clean motion. And there he stood, not the image from press releases or portraits, but a man who had walked through fire to reach this stage. His eyes scanned the room. Shannon shrank in her seat. Tony stopped breathing. Mark tried, futilely, to fix his expression. "I have seen everything," Jackson said, "and I will not stay silent." His voice was not loud, but it filled the room like thunder held in a fist. "Mark," he said, "you betrayed my trust." Mark opened his mouth, but Jackson cut him off before the lie could form. "Invoice 7,421, 8 crates of beef, triple the market rate, signed by you." Mark's lips moved. No sound followed. Jackson turned. "Shannon." She flinched. "You stole from the ones who earned the least, 50% of Tommy's tips last week. Do you deny it?" She didn't answer. Her silence was a confession. Jackson's gaze found Tony next. "You destroyed what made this house matter. You served lies and called them legacy." Tony didn't reply. He couldn't. One by one, the walls around them fell. The audience could feel the shift. Power had changed hands, and Jackson stood in its center, unmoved. "Mark, Shannon, Tony," he said, each name like a gavel. "You're fired." Silence cracked. Then whispers. Shocked, stunned, awed. The 3 figures on stage hesitated, caught in the spotlight of their own ruin. Then they rose. Slow, small. Not one reached to stop them. No one looked them in the eye. They left not with drama, but with the quiet shame of people who had finally been seen. No one looked their way as Mark, Shannon, and Tony stepped down from the platform, exiled not by force, but by truth. Jackson turned, not toward the board or the suits and polished shoes, but toward those who had kept the place alive when the people in charge forgot how to care. He looked at the dishwashers, the cooks, the cashiers, the ones with tired eyes and burn marks on their arms, the ones who gave more than they ever got. "Today is a new beginning," he said. The words weren't grand, but they didn't need to be, because in that moment, something shifted. Back straightened, eyes lifted. The invisible weight of fear began to loosen its grip. From near the center of the hall, a single clap broke the silence, then another, and another, until the sound became a tide, rushing through the room in a wave of real, roaring approval. Lon's eyes filled, her breath catching in her throat. Tommy grinned, the kind of grin that only comes after you've been told, finally, that you were right to hold on. The applause wasn't for a speech. It was for the truth. And when it died down, something else had taken its place in the air, something that felt like freedom. By morning, a company-wide email had landed in every inbox. The subject line was simple: "We start again." There was no branding, no fluff, just a list of promises. In Jackson's own words, from now on, every cent of every tip would belong to the employee who earned it. No percentage cuts, no silent skimming. No more games. Kitchens would be audited, unannounced. Storage areas inspected weekly. Spoiled ingredients would be tossed immediately. No questions. Mandatory retraining began that day. Not as a punishment, he wrote, but as a way to rebuild pride. And at the bottom of that message, 2 names stood out in bold: Lon and Tommy, appointed as peer trainers. Their stories, Jackson wrote, were proof of what this company could be when courage stood taller than convenience. "We are not fixing cracks," the final line read. "We are laying a new foundation." Across dozens of restaurants, screens glowed with that message. Employees read it once, then again, letting it sink in, testing its weight in their minds, and slowly, cautiously, the first real ripple of trust began to move. The change wasn't just in words. It was in the air. Walls were scrubbed, then painted, their new sheen catching the light, reflecting pride. Counters polished until fingerprints slid away. Machines cleaned until they hummed like they remembered how to work. And in between it all, laughter, not the stiff kind born of survival, but real, relaxed laughter, the kind that lingers. In one corner, Jackson knelt, scrubbing a stubborn stain from the floor, his shirt damp with sweat, his hands blackened by cleaner, but on his face, a calmness he hadn't felt in years. A few feet away, Lon coached a new line cook on knife technique, her voice low but sure. "Try it like this," she said. The young cook nodded, sliced, and waited. "Perfect," Lon smiled. Tommy, grinning like a kid on Christmas, slammed the last bolt into the refurbished stove. "She's ready," he shouted. Cheers broke out across the room. They drank coffee on their breaks. They shared small jokes over shared space. And with every nail hammered and tile cleaned, the fracture lines faded. In the kitchen, the broth simmered once again, golden, fragrant, full of memory. Jackson stirred it slowly, reverently, each swirl deliberate, like turning pages in a sacred book. The scent of herbs and slow-roasted bones curled through the air. Knives paused mid-chop. Conversation softened, and then silence. The soup wasn't just food. It was something they had thought lost. Jackson ladled it out, his movements gentle. One bowl, then another. Lon leaned in, voice hushed. "It's just like she described." Tommy's voice followed, thick, with awe. "It smells like before." They tasted it together. No one spoke. Then, a breath, a smile, and slowly the kitchen began to breathe again. They weren't just eating. They were remembering. The door opened, and time slowed. She stepped in, older now, smaller, but unmistakable. The woman whose letter had started it all. Jackson moved to meet her, his hand outstretched. Her fingers met his, light but certain. "Welcome back," he said. He led her to a corner table, the same one from years ago, where the sunlight always landed just right. The soup arrived, steam rising in quiet curls. She lifted her spoon, tasted, then paused. Her eyes glistened. "It's back," she whispered, as if saying it too loudly would make it vanish. The room held its breath, as if listening. Then, like dawn breaking, everything warmed. The bell above the door rang again. A girl ran in, taller now, but unmistakable. She threw her arms around Jackson. "I miss this so much," she said, her voice muffled against his chest. Her parents followed, beaming. Jackson guided them to a sunlit table. Bowls arrived. The little girl inhaled deeply, then tasted. Her laughter burst out, wild and unfiltered. People turned and smiled. Later, Jackson asked about school, about rainy days, about bread in brown paper bags. The father said, "We still talk about that day. Not the cold, the kindness servers glided across the floor. Tables buzzed with comfort. And at the center of it all, Jackson watched. Not as a CEO, but as someone who had made something whole again. He called Lon into the office. She entered nervously. "I want you to be assistant manager," he said. Her eyes widened. "Me?" "You held on to your values," he said, "when letting go would have been easier." Tears welled, fell. "I don't know if I deserve this." "You already proved you do." Through the small glass window, Tommy watched. He smiled, gave a thumbs up. Lon nodded, trembling slightly. "Then I accept." They shook hands, but it wasn't a job offer. It was a torch being passed. Later that evening, Jackson stood outside. The smell of soup and bread drifted out into the cool night. He watched through the glass. Lon explaining a dish to a smiling couple. Tommy making guests laugh so hard one wiped away tears. Every table full. But more importantly, every face relaxed. He saw it now, the way it used to be. And somehow, even better. This wasn't just a restaurant. It was a place where strangers became regulars, where stories passed between plates, where the heart of something sacred had been dug out of ruin. The cracks were still there, They always would be. But now, they had been mended with gold. He drew a deep breath. The future was unwritten, but it was ready. He stepped inside. Later that week, Jackson stood before his team, his voice steady, clear. "We've just come through a month of storms," he began, "and I've learned this. Kindness and trust are ingredients you can never replace." He let the silence follow. Let the truth settle. "If you believe in that, then stay with us, stand with us." He told them of the woman who smiled again over a bowl of soup, of a family once left in the rain, now warmed at a corner table. "Every smile I've seen today," Jackson said, "is the greatest reward I could ask for." Then, softer, "Follow us, walk with us, let's keep writing this journey together." The room was silent. No applause, just stillness. And in that stillness, a promise was born. A promise not just to rebuild, but to never forget what matters most.